going to reflect a little now on the rich young man and passing through the eye of the needle. And we have to begin with this imagery and work with it and work with a traditional understanding of the story. Firstly, it's perhaps about how rich you feel, about whether or not you think that you are rich or not. And sometimes it's always good to put a perspective on where we are in the Western world. Now, some of you may need to go and check this, but I thought, well, where shall I aim for today in terms of comparison? Okay. I checked with the DWP on Friday, that from autumn of this year, if you are eligible, the minimum state pension will be £7,865 a year, paid weekly, different ways. And in the grand scheme of things, that doesn't sound a great deal of money. However, if you go on to World Wealth Calculator, that will put you in the top 14% wealthiest people in the world. There are 5.6 billion people less wealthy than you. And you don't have to go far up the scale to get within the top few percent. In fact, average salary in this country is never a great thing to use, but the average salary is around about £26,000 to £30,000 a year, and that puts you in the top 1% of the world. So, most people in this country are wealthy, by God's standards, at least, even if you don't feel it yourself. And we have to think about that, because if you remember in the reading, the imagery here is that Jesus is saying it's impossible for us to detach ourselves from some of these things. It's not that it's hard. That's why the metaphor is so ridiculous. You can't fit a camel through the eye of the needle. Let's pause for a little Bible study here, because some people have thought, well, why did Jesus bring up this particular imagery? And there's a couple of ones to debunk. Firstly, was that there was an entrance to the city gates where the walls were too narrow and that a camel had to unload to pass through them. It's a nice idea, but no evidence at all that it happened. There's also the idea that in parts of the city, certainly close to inns or other places where there was wealth accumulated, that there were very narrow alleyways where you couldn't pass a camel through, or had to unload it to pass it through the city to stop thieves getting away. Okay, nice idea, but no evidence to support that. Okay, so just a little aside there. But I don't know whether you spotted when we did the reading that the exclamation that Jesus' disciples offered when he said this, they were amazed. They were going, well, what can we do? What are you asking of us here? This is impossible. This is impossible. What can we do? Part of that is because they weren't poor themselves. By Middle Eastern standards, Jesus himself, remember him saying what he's saying here, Jesus himself came from a good middle class family. He himself was middle class rich. He was a carpenter, a good trade to be in, a family of carpenters. They would have had a reasonable life for that time and place. He himself would have had the means to go around. Jesus was not the poor person of Israel. Neither were his family. And neither, by implication, were his followers either. They were trained, they were fishermen, they were good with money. They were people that, again, were probably the middle classes of their time. There's a bit of a gap because we don't have it down, but things like the fishermen, it would go against the gospel if he meant their families all suffered and died and went into poverty as a result of them following Jesus. It would be counter-gospel. So it would seem to me that, and what other people have thought, that in fact their businesses were good enough to survive without them, that they actually had workers to take it on. They have businesses, middle-class businesses, for which provided for them and for their families. In which case, this starts to unravel a little bit in terms of why Jesus said it, and the context of who Jesus was, who his disciples was, who we are, actually. It all starts to go, well, he's saying it's impossible, but he gave the illustration. Where do we go forward with it? I'm going to open up another way of looking at what Jesus said here, and this is where things get potentially lost in the nuances of translation here. Whether it's right or not, we can leave it to you, but what I would suggest is that we keep both ideas as we go forward. Okay. First off, Jesus spoke Aramaic, okay? And the Aramaic for rope is gamala. In the Greek-speaking world, and when it gets translated to Greek, it becomes camelos. The Gospels were predominantly an oral tradition, okay? Camelos sounds remarkably similar to the other Greek word for camel, camelos. So, people have put forward the idea, and I think it's quite a convincing one, that in fact, what Jesus said, it's harder for rope to pass through the eye of an eagle than for a rich man to enter God. That would seem, it's not as outlandish as the other translation, which is what makes it so appealing. But many are convinced by the argument that in fact Jesus meant rope. It's harder for rope to pass through the eye of an eagle than for a rich man to enter. Because then there is an opportunity, it's not impossible. You've got a piece of rope, what have you got to do to get it through the eye of an eagle? You've actually got to unwind it, haven't you? You've got to do it strand by strand. It'll be a slow, painful process. But that seems to be perhaps what Jesus is saying here. Camelos and camelos. So you can decide which one you prefer. But like I say, you can keep both, just because the first metaphor is, you keep it in your mind, don't you? Whereas perhaps trying to put a rope through the eye of a needle, it wouldn't, you don't remember it so well. But either way now, you can try and remember both. And using both of those ideas, one of the things that I wanted to bring to the fellowship today is how we, as a fellowship, go forward together. Because some things we find really hard, and perhaps one way I could say it is this: it's perhaps easier to fit the whole of Bolton Lane through the eye of a needle than it is for us to think that we've got a sustainable and long-term future. It's been something we've always battled with during our time, that being able to sustain ourselves financially, to think that we're going to be here in 5, 10, 50, well, we're celebrating 60 years next year. Is there any possible way we can be here in another 60 years' time? Part of what we will do, Mike Fagredo, our regional minister, is coming this next week, and he will help start reflect on this in more detail. But one thing that we will all do over the next few months is sort of grab some of this, take part in some sort of vision and thinking for the coming year, what we need to try and raise, how we might be able to do that, and for us to all engage in that, to put together a vision that is with God, with each other, and that we go forward, not thinking in a very financial way, that thinking, oh, it's all about numbers. No, because that's not of God. We're going to do this together with God, and we're going to try and work out a way, because we have been prompted now by God to think about this. Home mission has prompted us. God has prompted us through home mission. We found out last week, we can give thanks to them and thanks to God that we've got next year's grant. But we don't want God doesn't want us to be in this position every year, to think that each year it's, will we be here next year? Will you be able to sustain someone freed up to minister next year? And the fellowship is still a church that, whether I'm here or not, it's very helpful to have someone freed up to be the glue to make the connections, to move things forward. And so, one of my great pieces of scripture is Ecclesiastes 3, 1-10, where there's a time for everything, and there is a time to be born and a time to die. But I don't think God is saying, well, your time's coming up now as a fellowship, because all fellowships' times come and go. But God's saying, no, your time is, you've got so much going on here, and I want to help you build a sustainable future. These things down at the front here were just for what I was going to say now. Is that we're involved in so many things where we're sharing God's love in the world, and people are getting touched by that. That our little harvest display here was given by a group associated with Sure Start. They knew about our food bank and what we did, and people that were part of that group put that little display for us together and given it to us. You know, God's Spirit has touched them and has come back through. I don't know who bought the little Courtney's, but I didn't know she was going to bring the little grass head. But it's that connection, deep connection with young people that we've known for many years now. And it's all the people and conversations that many of us have through each week. Just speak of God's influence in and through us, and how He wants that to continue and go forward. You would have seen, I don't know whether Maureen had a chance, just because she didn't mention it on the notes, don't know whether it's on there, about the young man Nathan that I saw. Is it on the notices this week? It's not. Oh, is it on the screen? So I'm glad you spotted it. But it's the sort of people now we are getting in touch with that otherwise you'd never, unless we were working with God, you'd never find out. So it was actually through a good Christian friend in Swadlincote, who we've known for many years, but she knows about what we do in all different ways. And she contacted me because a friend of hers, she's got a young man living in a tent in her back garden, and that's because it's her daughter's boyfriend, who's 17. And the story there, that's the parents are separated, both Class A drug users. Father's got significant mental health issues. He is trying to get back with his dad when he gets moved to a safer area and a bigger place. But the reality is, the 17-year-old Nathan, who was a lovely, well-spoken lad, I stood and had this conversation by his tent on Thursday night. And we thought he was actually 18, because part of this issue is when you're 18, you become adult. He's actually not 18 until next May, which means he could certainly spend the whole of the winter out in that tent. And for anybody here who's already feeling the chill, in our comfy rooms, in our duvets in bed, we have to stop for a moment to think, it's very, very close by. But not to dwell in there, it's the fact that we are now connected to these people, and to many other conversations that we will have, and the things in which we help through. How many were there, Jenny, this week? How many were on the list? About 30?
36 this week.
36.
Plus we usually have 5 for the refuge.
Yeah, so there we go, 36 families supported this week, plus 5 for the refuge. And though we are an ecumenical venture, and we couldn't do it without doing it all together, we drive it forward. Okay, so you always worry that long term, if anything significantly happened here, where it would go long term. But we don't have to sit here in woe and think, how do we do this, how do we go forward? Because the really important part of that scripture is just that bit after that, where Jesus says, we think these things are impossible, but nothing is impossible with God. One thing that I am so always positive and upbeat about, every day I wake up is think of what we achieve and do for God. Some things we have felt impossible that we've done. And perhaps going forward, what we want to do is, at the moment, achieve the impossible. We want to think, we know we've got a future. And part of what we will do together is to start that journey going forward. So we aren't so hand to mouth. Let's not err on the human, let's err on the God and think nothing is impossible with God.